Well, it's a blessing to be with everyone. It's good to see familiar faces. I'm glad you're all doing well and that the good Lord has given you this time to come together as we like to do and sing some hymns and listen to his holy word and lift one another up in prayer. So I want us to step back a little bit. I was at a church earlier and I preached, and another gentleman had also been there who is a deacon, and he did a sermon. I said, "What did you do your sermon on this week, Deacon?" He said, "I talked about marriage." And I said, "Well, you are a brave man because I will not do that." So today I am not preaching about marriage, but marriage does come in and is relevant to what I want to talk about. One thing I know as someone who's a professor of psychology is that every one of us walks around with this framework in our mind that allows us to make sense of the world. In psychology, we talk about things called schemas. We all have a schema. So you know how to understand, how to engage the world, and how to make sense out of it. A perfect example, as all of you know, I'm in the United States, which is the land of fast food. Okay, we Americans, we love our fast food because it's very predictable for us. We know when we walk into those big golden arches or one of these other big burger places, we walk in, we go to the counter, the person at the counter will stare at us. They have no personal skills. They'll mumble something that we don't understand. We look at this menu on the wall and yell out a number. And then that person does something, takes our money. We step to the left. They bring the food to us, very healthy American food, and 80% of it is right. The rest is wrong. We know this is going to happen, but we don't argue about it because the chances of getting any real help from the teenager who just wants to play video games is null. So we take our really bad food, we go and sit. That is the standard schema in the United States. So if you come visit us and you haven't been to one of our fast food cuisine places, come and you will see that's what it is. If you want to try and fight about it, argue, or mix things up, you're just getting in a lot of trouble. Now, we had a fast food chain emerge in the United States called Chick-fil-A. Some of you may have heard of it, or maybe you've been to one. Chick-fil-A is a Christian-run company. So when they first came to the United States, or really spread throughout the United States from Georgia, I remember my wife and I going there, and I had the schema in my head. This is how it's going to unfold. And the first thing they do is like greet you with a smile and say, "How are you? How can I serve you?" And I was floored. I said to my wife, "We have to leave. This is a cult." Okay? Because they did not follow the schema of a fast food restaurant, okay? So I bring this up because I want you to be aware that we all have this way of engaging the world. Now, philosophers and theologians call this schema something else. Psychologists say schema. Philosophers and theologians call this, and you've heard this term, my friends, a worldview. We all have a worldview. And much of the writing and the research done by philosophers and theologians say, if you look at a worldview, it really answers four primary questions. The first one is this: what does it mean to be a human being? Okay, that's a primary worldview question. Every philosopher, every theologian, every religion has an answer for that. The second one is, what is the nature of the world? So what's the world made up of? What makes the world what it is? The third question is, what's wrong with the world? Okay, because we know it's not as it should be. And then the fourth one is, how can what's wrong with the world be fixed, be corrected? So this is constantly the set of questions you have in your head as you engage the world. And your religion, your faith, has given you answers, okay? It's given you answers. Now, this is where a lot of times I'll get students. I teach a course here called The Psychology of Religion, and they'll say, "Well, Dr. Hankle, then you're saying any religion can be true, right? Because they just answer that question." I say, "Oh, no. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you want to live a fulfilling, resilient human life, you better have the right answers to those questions." You see where I'm going, right? I said it's very much like if I took my dirty socks and put them in the coffee machine, I better not expect the socks to be clean. And if I drink what comes out, well, I live in Virginia Beach. Our water's brown half the time. Anyway, but you get the idea, right? A machine is meant to do something, and it does it best and functions well when it does what it's meant to do. A human being is meant to live a certain way, and the Christian faith teaches us what that is. When we live that life, we are resilient. We find meaning and purpose. So I'm not saying any answer to these questions is right. Now, what I want to do, though, is show you folks today that Psalm 8, the psalm we read today, does a beautiful job in framing not just how our worldview looks or the answers to it, but it does it in a very visually poetic way. And so let me walk through that, and you're going to see Psalm 8 is a beautiful psalm that connects us to the Old Testament reading and the gospel. the Old Testament reading and the gospel. You saw that Psalm 8 starts and finishes with the same line. Now, I'm using the ESV version. I know you guys use the New King James Version, but they're very similar. So the first line in Psalm 8 is this: O Lord, our governor, how excellent is your name in all the world. You have set your glory above the heavens. Okay, line 9, the last line in the psalm, says the exact same thing. O Lord, our governor, how excellent is your name in all the world. Both of those lines are the same thing. What is the psalmist doing? The psalmist is reminding us that we live in a created world that begins with God and ends with God. All of reality begins with God, who is glorified, whose name is powerful, and all of reality ends in God. It returns to God, Father. The most profound part of the world, history itself, starts with God, ends with God, and even our most mundane human life. I have this image when the child is born and cries out for the first time. That is them giving praise to God for the blessed life, no matter how long it will be or short, that they engage. And at the end of life, when I have been with a number of people that at that point, and they breathe that last, it is again them giving themselves back to the God who created them. Our world consists of bookends, and both those bookends are the majesty and power of God. Psalm 8 reminds us that our lives, the world we live in, reality starts and ends with God. And then if you follow the lines a little bit, it goes down a little further, and the next thing the psalmist wants to show us is creation, right? And again, it bookends creation. So if you go to line 3, it says, when I consider the heavens, even the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, okay? So creation is brought out by the psalmist. But then go up to, when you go up to the verse 6, you see, again, we're talking about creation, but humanity's role in creation. It says, you made him to have dominion over the works of your hands, and you've put all things in subjection under his feet. And it goes on and talks about the sheep, the beasts, and all the animals of the world. What are we learning here? We learned first that everything begins and ends with God. And now we're looking that God has created, given creation, this beautiful self-reflection. When we look at the created order, when we look at the heavens, when we look at what God has done, it can do nothing else but speak to him. As you know, St. Chad's, the group I'm a part of, and Father Rick is a part of, we have a Celtic line in our spirituality. And no one says it more beautifully than the Celts when they remind us of the glorious presence of God in all of creation. When we look at the smoke coming off the mountains, we're struck with awe that the breath of God breathes from the mountains. When we look at the green trees, we see nothing but the vibrancy of the life of God in all of created order. It is a beautiful thing, and we are meant to see it that way. But as the psalm said, we also are partakers of caring for and having dominion over creation. Now, that word dominion kind of gets a bad rap. We often think of dominion meaning we lord over creation to do what we want with it for our own selfish needs. That is not what dominion means. It means we are caretakers. We are entrusted with God's creation. In fact, dare I say, we are partakers in giving that creation order and beauty and structure. I know many of you on this are of the British descent, of my English friends. And one of the most beautiful things here in Virginia is when we go to Colonial Williamsburg and walk the palace gardens. So we have the governor's mansion, and it is in the style of an 18th century British garden. It is beautiful, but what the beauty of what British gardening is all the geometric figures and lines. It is very well ordered. Creation is beautifully ordered. What did we read in Genesis today, my friends? Nothing but the fact that God allows humanity to be part of taking and giving order to creation. It says here, if you start with verse 19 from Genesis chapter 2, now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field, every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature that was its name. The man gave names to the livestock, the birds of heaven. You see what God is doing? God is inviting humanity into the participation and ordering of creation. So creation, what the psalmist is teaching us, has two purposes in this world we live in. The first being, quite simply, to reflect the divine, to show us who God is, to give us a flavor of God's nature, and we are to be partakers and orderers and stewards of that very order. It is our calling, and it is the place where we can find and encounter God. So the psalm did two things so far. Reminded us that everything begins and ends with God, reminds us that the created order that we have reflects the glory of God, and that we are partakers in the care of that created order. The third part, and this is what's beautiful if you look at the psalm, it kind of has a middle piece, and the middle piece is asking a very profound question. And that profound question is this: what is man? Ooh, there it is, right? And isn't it beautiful? So we start with the heavens and the glory of God, and it comes right back to humanity. And are we not that bridge between the divine and the mundane? The bridge between God, and we reflect his image, yet we are participants in and members of creation. I think the psalmist, I'm sure it's intentional, but puts us at that center. And how do you respond to that question? What is man? What is the human person? Well, one of my favorite hobbies is history. I'm more of a colonial American history fanatic, but one of my favorite movies, it's about our Civil War here in the United States, is called Gettysburg. I'm probably a fan of the movie because Gettysburg happened in my home state of Pennsylvania. And it was one of those horrific battles of our Civil War. I think more men died in that battle than numerous other battles that Americans have fought. But in that movie is a wonderful scene, okay? So my favorite Colonel Chamberlain from the New England states, it has just gone through this battle, and he's sitting there with his Irish recruit. Of course, you know, at this time in the United States, the Irish came, and being a great country that we are, we said, oh, you're from Ireland and you want to be a citizen? Come on, you can fight in our war. So they got jammed right in the war. But this Irish recruit, he's a sergeant in the army. They're sitting there after this battle, and they're sweating, and they're looking, and they're just asking questions about this war. What are these African Americans and enslaved people? What do you think of them? Who are these Confederates? You know, the enemies of the United States. And so they have this discussion, and Chamberlain quotes one of England's most famous men. He quotes Shakespeare, and he says this: "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculty! How in form and moving! How expressed and admirable in action! How like an angel in apprehension! How like a god! The beauty of the world, the paragon of the animal world." Okay? Chamberlain is showing us that all through history, we have captured this beauty, this element of the human condition that makes us more than the created order, more than just another animal. Now, of course, the good Irish recruit who's been through hell and back says to the sweet colonel, and forgive my accent, but he'll say, dear colonel, my friend, you have this view of human beings that makes them like angels. But I'll tell you, my good friend, my dear colonel, I've seen them to be nothing but a devil, a killing machine. Forgive me for that. That's the best I can do. But the point being, he is looking at another side of man. What is the psalmist trying to teach us that says, you have made them a little lower than the angels? The psalmist is reminding us that no matter how bleak things look, we always are more than just an evolved animal. We are not an evolved animal. We are created lower than the angels. We have a dignity, a beautiful human dignity that is reflected in us, that no matter how much we try and tear it down and destroy it, there is some spark of the divine in the human person, some spark of the divine. You know, most of the world, philosophers and intellectuals, believe that until Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Descent of Man. And then as that philosophy permeated human thinking and materialism became the popular worldview, we no longer saw ourselves in such a light. We now see ourselves as nothing more than an animal. And that, my friends, as you know, is a dangerous place to go. And why it's dangerous is because when I can look at another human being and no longer see the human dignity in them, I have no ethical problem to enslave them for what I want, to kill them, to destroy them. When a human baby is no longer a human being, it is merely a fetus to be destroyed and used for experimentation. When a Jewish individual is no longer a human being, I can put them in camps, I can gas them, and I can use their skin for lamps. You see what I mean? It's a dangerous philosophy. And the scriptures refuse to let us go there. And they tell us always the human person has that divine spark. The other beautiful thing of that reading in Genesis is now we see God creating the human being in the way he wants it to be, which is a relational creature. Human beings are meant for relationships. That's why God, after he shows Adam all the animals, says, "What do you think, Adam?" And Adam goes, "It's cool. I'm having some fun here, but it's really not fulfilling." And God gives him a partner. He gives him Eve. Now, I love this story because it says so much. When he creates Eve, he creates Adam a helper, okay? Now, some of the ladies get uptight. They see that word helper and they're like, "Now what are you trying to tell me here, Father Dom?" And I said, "Well, back up. Now, I am no Hebrew scholar, but in my ignorance, I try to find the words as best as I can. And that word for helper is ezer. And beautifully, that Hebrew word means one corresponding to. The implication is an equality. And to support that, another thing to think about is those Near Eastern stories of creation. They often tell us something about what people believe. And here's what I mean by that. If you understand the Hindu story of creation, they believe that Brahman, their god Brahma, right? That the different classes of people were made from the different parts of Brahma's body. Of course, the untouchables, which come from the Shudras, came from the feet of Brahma. And because they are of the feet of Brahma, it justifies them doing all the menial tasks for the society, okay? Where does God take what he needs to create Eve? From the side of man, which means an equality, right? An equal dignity. Both are meant for equal dignity. In fact, when does the fall part happen? I think it's chapter 3, right? When humans sin, now it all falls apart. So why is this important? What am I trying to say to you? We are created for relationship with God and with one another, right? It's who we are. If we're made in the image of God, God within himself is one God, three divine persons, a communion of love. God creates us to be in communion, not just with him, but with one another. Why does Jesus rail against divorce in the New Testament? Because it breaks the intended, created purpose of humanity to be in relationship, to be in communion. Marriage is the simplest form of community that we have. And when we tear it apart, we're doing damage to what God intended. And some people think, well, that's no big deal. And I'm certainly not here to put a guilt trip on anyone who's been divorced. That's not what I mean. But it's no different than the last time I was with you guys, we talked about white magic. Remember, Deacon Aaron said, there's people and there's lots of teenagers running around, they're Wiccans now. Oh, what does it hurt? They think it's white magic, it's good magic. It hurts because it creates a view of the world that isn't true. It creates a view of the world that is distorted. Divorce, when people pull apart, distorts the nature of who we are. Now, people get divorced because sin permeates the world, right? Nobody wants a divorce. Like, they don't go into marriage saying, "I really can't wait to be divorced." What happens is sin, and I don't even mean their personal sin, but living in the context of sin pulls them apart, right? It pulls them apart. In fact, why did Jesus say, "Hey, Moses let you guys divorce your wives"? You know why he said that? Because they were sinning. And how were they sinning? If I don't want to be married to you anymore, what might I do? I'll have you stoned. I'll kill you. I'll find a way to do away with you. This is where that was going. And Jesus said, well, Moses let you guys do that so you can manage your sin. I'm telling you, you shouldn't be doing that because it's not how you were intended to be. Richard Foster, one of my favorite authors, talks about something called the Emmanuel principle. And he says, we are so much created for relationship with God and with one another that God wants to dwell with us, in community with us, right? He says, if you read the Old Testament from the very beginning through its end, it is a story of the with life God. God enters into relationship and community with Adam and then with Eve, with a couple. God enters into relationship with Adam and Eve and their offspring, a family. He enters into relationship with Abraham and all of Abraham's tribes. Then he enters into relationship with a nation, the nation of Israel. Then he enters into relationship with the whole world through his son, Jesus Christ. God wants us to be in communion because we are created for community. It is the Emmanuel principle. This is why you often hear Father Dom say, a true spiritual law is this: sin always divides, but grace unites. Sin divides. When we choose our own way, when we choose something other than how God intended us to live, we cause separation. But when we choose the life of grace, the God with us life, God will unite. God finds a way to unite. So what have I said about these readings? How I know I go in my circles, Father Dom is not a very direct preacher as some of our other good members. Let me summarize what I want you to take. What I think these scriptures teach us about how the world should be and how we should live. First is this: you must believe and understand everything begins with God in his divine goodness, where he creates out of pure love, and everything returns to God, redeemed through the person of Jesus Christ, to find its place back in the Godhead. That we exist in the midst of a created order, and that is a gift. The Celts will often say nature was created for us as much as we were created for nature, right? Nature is created for us, to feed us, for us to find the glory of God in, but we are created for nature, to be its caretakers, its orderers, its stewards. The third thing, we are not merely a different degree of animal in creation, we are unique, created with the divine image, with the divine spark, to live the life that God calls us to live. And that created in God's image means we are created for relationship with God first and with one another. I love the Hebrews reading, such a long reading, and I'm only going to take the first couple verses because it reminds us where to go to find those answers to those worldview questions, where to go to build our schema so we can understand the world. It says this. Let me get to it very quickly here. It's such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful point that it makes. It says here, let me see, where's my Hebrews? Here's my Hebrews. This is chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away for it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? Hebrews is saying we need to pay closer attention to what God has given us through his holy word, through his apostolic tradition, through his created order. When we come up with our own answers, my friends, we are nothing more than a coffee machine filled with dirty socks. May God bless you all.